And live. Okay, so I didn't
Right.
come prepared with a controversial, not a controversial, it's not always controversial, but like topic or question to like spark conversation. Do either of you have any like hot topics unrelated to like kick off our casual conversation?
I have one that we've used before, but it's been a while. It's good.
Is it React server components are the worst? Because that would be really ironic if that was the case. That'd be really awkward.
No, do you put there's several ways. There's just things in life that people are opinionated about. Like, do you put milk and then cereal? Or do you put cereal and then milk?
Wait, people put milk and then cereal?
See,
I
crazy
know,
people.
I know, right? Not me.
Oh,
The
you
other one
don't?
is
Why would you
Oh.
do
do you
that?
put water on your toothpaste or on your toothbrush and then the paste? Water
You
at
can't put
all?
water directly on the toothpaste without the toothbrush, can you? Or you're saying with the tooth, like
Just put the
like you
water
s-
right in the
yeah,
toothpaste
like
container.
mix it up right
Tube.
there.
So gross.
Just right on there.
Oh, right.
That would be really interesting.
Yeah. And I'm also picky about my toilet paper. My toilet paper has to go over, not under.
Oh
Really?
yeah. The
I've
best
never paid
visualization
attention.
of this I saw is that beards are cool. So imagine a toilet paper roll with the paper coming down off the front. That's like a beard. But mullets
Oh,
are not cool,
Ah, okay.
right? If the
Beard's
toilet
cool,
paper's
mullet's
coming down the
bad.
backside.
If anybody watching has a mullet, don't take
we
offense.
apologize.
Though, if you have children, the only reason that I can imagine that you should ever put it around the backside is if you have children, you will probably know that children love to take that roll and just spin the
Oh,
hell out
yeah.
of it. And now you've got an entire roll of toilet paper on your floor. But if you run it around the backside, the tendency
Oh,
would
it
be
just
to roll it this way,
spins.
not to,
Oh,
not to
I've never
push
even
it
thought
up.
about that.
The
Right,
same
so-
logic also applies for mullets, and maybe that's the reason that has come back as a fad now.
Oh, man.
Maybe not.
I'm
were
not
at
sure
a-
exactly what you're insinuating.
I don't know either. We were at a wedding in Nashville. Amy and I didn't get to see
Oh,
each
yeah.
other. Like we didn't have a free minute, but the groom who we like didn't know, super nice, didn't really know very well. Like I only met him for a couple hours at once. Anyway, we showed up and like people were talking about the families, and we're talking about his family like being super country, and there were like 2 or 3 mullets in the audience from, I assume,
Were there-
from his side of the family.
Well, there's several levels of that. Then there's cowboy hats, and then there's rat tails.
I didn't see any rat tails.
That's good.
Yeah.
We used to, when I worked downtown, we would count rat tails during CMA week. When we would go out to lunch, we'd like, okay,
Yeah.
how many can we find?
I guess I bet that was fun too, being downtown or being like in the industry for that time, or like in Nashville. I mean, no.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody in the chat. We'll officially get started like really quickly. As the title implies, React server components and next epoch. Is epoch like a common? I guess we could say this and talk through it. Is epoch like a common verbiage for just like next iteration of something?
Yeah. Though there is some confusion whether it's pronounced epoch or epic. I think either is actually valid.
Okay. I would get
But
confused.
I say epoch because otherwise
Yeah.
people think you're saying a different word.
Yeah.
And, you know, less ambiguity is better.
Yep. Epic gives me like not PTSD, but I worked in at FedEx, and we practiced something called SAFe, which is scaled agile framework, which is meant to be to like have structure for agile at really big companies. And so everything would roll up to like different levels of like, you had stories and you had something, and then you had epics, which was like themes across multiple organizations.
Right.
But that planning and stuff was a mess. Like it really didn't. Nobody felt really good about what we were doing. We were trying to follow the letter of the law for SAFe, and it just was like, we don't need to do a lot of this. So I have like not good connotation when I think about
So we'll say epoch.
epics. There you go. I like
Yeah,
it.
and the epoch is generally the highest level sort of thing that happens. But yeah, you'll see it around programming used as such.
Sweet. Well, are you all ready to officially kick off?
Oh yeah, let's do it.
Sure.
Let me get my music ready also. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Compressed FM, a podcast all about web development and design with a little bit of zest. In this episode, we're going to talk about React server components and the next epoch of RedwoodJS.
Web development and design, who would have guessed? Well, we can do them both, even add a little zest. So turn up the volume, get ready for the best. Let's get it started in this episode of Compress.
What's up, everyone? My name is James Q. Quick, and I am a developer, speaker, and teacher. I've changed from full-time content creator. I don't like that as much anymore. So that's my old tagline that I'm re-embracing again.
Love it. Hello, my name is Amy Dutton, and I am a lead maintainer for the RedwoodJS core team.
Which is very coincidental because today we have on Tom to talk about, as we said, React server components, the next epoch of RedwoodJS. A fun fact, and I mentioned this, I think right before we went live, Tom actually joined for a live stream of mine 3 years ago, probably, I think during COVID when I kind of first started streaming, and talked about at that point, what Redwood was. And I had the very minimal comparison or understanding of just going straight to Ruby on Rails in comparison to the JavaScript ecosystem. And there's lots of many intricate details that differentiate that. And we'll get into any and all of those and kind of looking towards the future of Redwood, which I am incredibly excited about. So Tom, welcome to the stream, to the podcast. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about your background?
Yeah, hi, Tom Preston Werner here. Thanks, James. Thanks, Amy, for having me on. My background, well, I wanted to be a physicist, but that was all math, so I went into computers, and then I started doing startups, and then I created GitHub, and that was super fun. And then since then, I've been doing various kind of startup things and building open source tools and kind of doing things that are harder to do when you don't have sort of the resources that I now have. So I do weird things that are really challenging, and so one of those is creating RedwoodJS, a web application framework. Those things tend to be large and difficult. I thought that would be a nice challenge. So here I am doing that, assembling a team to work on that. And we've been doing that for 4 years, I think, now, from when we very, very first started. Hard to imagine. And so I love programming. I love making developers' lives easier and building tools and kind of living on the bleeding edge. So that brings us to where we are now, trying to implement React server components.
I'm particularly excited about this from two perspectives. One is the React server component specifically. I've heard about it for a while. I heard about, I don't know, it's one of those things where I heard about it enough to the point where I went and did some research and started playing around with it. And I think I get the general idea and the general benefits and stuff. But also, again, talking about future of something like RedwoodJS. And I was telling Amy, I'm working on this talk about the impact that AI specifically is having on developer experience. And some of my talk is going through the progression of just how things change from a developer perspective and how ideally, as we get better at programming and tools and platforms and hosting and all those things, it should be easier for us to build applications. We should be able to do that quicker, easier, faster, more efficiently, all those things. And I think obviously Redwood fits into that category of recognizing a need of developers for here's a bunch of tools, piece them together, have opinions, all those things. So what's your overview of why you created, why you started, and why you're continuing to work on Redwood as a whole?
Redwood really came out of some experiences at a previous startup I was doing with another GitHub co-founder, Scott. We were creating what was called Chatterbug, which was an application that it was language learning, so foreign language learning. We thought that would be cool. We were building that out in Berlin, had a big team there. And so while we were doing that, we started using a pattern that looked a lot like what Redwood has become. So it was, we were using Rails at the time, building a pretty standard Rails app. But then we started using we're using React on the front end. And then we created a mobile client where we wanted GraphQL. So now we had GraphQL alongside the Rails app using the Ruby GraphQL thing. And then we started rebuilding sort of the front end of the main web app with React consuming the GraphQL, because when you have GraphQL and it's just sitting there, it's really easy to consume. It's a really great way to get at your data when you have an API and a team that's building a GraphQL backend. And so coming out of that turned out to look like a really nice way to develop. The only problem was we were still writing Ruby for the backend and JavaScript TypeScript for the front end, which was kind of weird, right? It's like we could do this back end stuff in JavaScript, and that would probably be a better fit. And we would then only need to hire JavaScript developers. And it's always nice to sort of decrease the number of technologies or languages that you're using. So I thought that would be cool. So that's one side of things. And the other side was I've been involved with Netlify since they were 2 people, and have invested in them in a long time. And I was thinking about how they use Lambda functions. They make it really easy to create static applications, static websites, and deploy AWS Lambda functions. I thought it would be really neat to be able to leverage that infrastructure using a framework. And so React and communicating to a backend that would live on Lambda functions seemed like a cool way to do that. Now we've diverged significantly in Redwood since then, but that's where we started. And where we're ending up now is where that's really not at all what we're doing or what we're optimizing for. But this is the history of Redwood. Why it kind of looked like that in the beginning was you'd have a React front end that could be statically delivered on a CDN. You'd have a backend that would be a GraphQL API that you could serve via Lambda functions. And then you'd talk GraphQL from the front end to the back end, and then you'd have a database. So we're trying to build a full stack web application framework that would work in that environment. And I thought that would be really neat. Turns out that there are certain challenges in doing that, especially given some performance limitations of Lambdas. In a lot of cases, in some scenarios, they work okay, but in others where you're really looking for really high performance, they become more challenging. So we've kind of started drifting away from that quite a few years ago. Most people that are using RedwoodJS today deploy in a serverful fashion to AWS or Render or Fly.io or other places where they can get the kind of performance that you get from having an application that is just sitting there always running, at the disadvantage that sometimes certain types of scaling can be a little harder. But that's where we came from, and it was just like, here's a thing that's possible that we could do and could really make people's lives easier and bring a full stack web application framework to the JavaScript and TypeScript world, which 4 years ago looks, different than it does today. And really, people were cobbling together all kinds of random stuff. And there wasn't really something out there that sort of bundled everything together to say, here's your front end, here's your back end, here's your database, here's your testing, here's, things like Storybook, and let's make them all really work well together. That really wasn't a thing. And coming from the Rails world in the past, that felt like something that was missing and an opportunity to create something in that space.
It's kind of funny to think about, like, I will semi-quote you, but I'm proud to say that, like, I've had similar opinions, but you just explained and articulated it better than I ever have on a recent podcast that I listened to you as a guest. And it's the idea of, like, we've kind of come full circle. Like, we went through, like, the traditional, like, you have a dedicated backend and you run everything on the server and it spits back out HTML that gets rendered on the page. You have jQuery or something on the front end to do interactive stuff. And then we went to SPAs with React, and not the first one, but like React and other frameworks, like really making that the default. And then we went to like the Jamstack and completely static. And then we realized, like, we really need server. And now the whole, like, phenomenon seems to be the focus on, like, not only do we need server, but we need it kind of in a modern way. And you've talked about I forget exactly, kind of like a cyclone idea where you're circling back, but you're also still moving in, maybe we don't definitively know the right direction, but it seems like the right direction. Can you talk about, like, almost like the irony of how we've kind of come full circle in the last, like, few years with web development, what we think of as best practices, but how we're also, like, making strides towards something new and different and better for developers?
Yeah, technology development often looks cyclical in this way, where you've got some technology, and on the one side, you start somewhere, like you're saying with HTML. In the earliest days of the web, you just had static HTML files that you put on a server somewhere and you served them, and that was it. And then you go some years down the road, and now you've got dynamic backends that are taking in data and putting it in databases, and then dynamically spitting out new HTML to send to the browser. And that's cool, right? That's sort of the blog. That's like the blogging revolution in the early 2000s. And then with the advent of things like Jekyll, then people start to think, like, hey, we could like pre-render these things. Like, why are we serving WordPress out? Like, why is every request pulling from a database. I mean, you can do caching and stuff, but at the end of the day, you've got to worry about security vulnerabilities and performance issues, and nobody likes that. And that's part of where Jekyll came from. Why I created Jekyll was I was tired of losing my blogs over the years because they were on some, server that, and all of the database was hosted there and all my content was there. And then I'd get distracted for a year and stop paying for that thing. My credit card would expire. And then they would just delete everything in my database. And I'd be like, I never really backed that up, did I? So I was really tired of losing content. And so that's where Jekyll came from, where it's like, well, if I put it in a Git repository and I put that on GitHub, I will literally for the rest of my life never ever lose that content. And that was really desirable. So that's kind of where some of the Jamstack concepts began. And I was working with the Netlify guys in the really early days, thinking about that stuff. And then you go a little bit further and now you've got now you're coming back and you're like, yeah, but servers were really nice. Like, what if we had servers? We go through the SPA sort of phase, right? Where SPAs are really great for certain things, like, say, Spotify, like a music client or something, where, you want it to be extremely responsive. You want it to feel like a native app. You don't want to be going back to the server and rendering HTML there. Like, you'd prefer to do that in the client, and you're not really doing page changes in the way that you are with a traditional kind of SaaS app. Right, but when you're doing a traditional web application SaaS kind of thing, like an SPA starts to provide limitations. It starts to create limitations on performance and how much JavaScript you've got to send down, right? And so we go this way, and it starts to we feel the consequences. Like, you're always at every stage, there's benefits and drawbacks, and that's why it looks cyclical, is because you start static and then you go dynamic and you're like, hey, we've got all these advantages here, but now we've got security and performance issues. So then you're like, okay, well, let's go back and make things more static, like Jamstack. And you're like, oh, well, that's pretty great. And we can do an SPA architecture really well this way. But now we're having to shovel, mountains of JavaScript down to the client and execute those. And that makes things slower. And like, what do you do with your OG, your Open Graph tags so that they can unfurl on Twitter and stuff, right? Like, now that doesn't work. We got to figure out a way to paper over that with edge functions or something, right? So now you're making it more complicated and you're seeing the drawbacks. And then we're like, what was really cool when we had servers? Because that solves different problems. So then we go back to servers like we are now with React Server Components, because there's advantages there. But guess what? We're always kind of going up this spiral. That's the way I see it. Like, if you look at it from the top down, it just looks like a circle. And you can be like, oh, server, static, server static, back and forth, or server client. But really, if you look at it from the side, or, from an oblique angle, you can see that every time we go around this circle, we sort of invent something new. We solve a new set of problems. We become better at something. And I think that's the phase that we're kind of always in. And you see it here. And the world becomes more complicated and people's expectations become more. Right? What people demand out of a web application today is very different than what they expected in 2004, for instance, right? We've become much more sophisticated. That tends to make our tooling also more sophisticated, but that generally means that it's more complicated. And so we're always trying to find solutions to those problems. And nobody's trying to make anything more complicated. It's just that through time, things add up and become more complicated. And hopefully at some point we can consolidate certain things and make certain parts of it less complicated, but still as powerful or more powerful. So React Server Components, to me, is another one of those attempts to say things have become really complicated in this sort of SPA world that a lot of people use React in. We could solve a lot of problems if we can do more things on the server and deliver static HTML on first page load so that you can do your OG tags and have really good performance, and execute your data fetching on the server side as much as possible, because that's actually really nice. I miss that from Rails, right? And we feel this in Redwood today, where it's like, yeah, if you do a lot of data fetching and certain things rely on other things, you've got nesting and you're spreading your data fetching out through a stack of components, you can get into waterfall scenarios where now you've got to wait for every sort of data fetch to complete before the next one can start. If you put all of that on the server, you don't really see the waterfall issues, even if you're doing things sequentially, because you don't have the latency of a client to server interaction. And so that's where we're at. We're trying to make things more simple. I think React Server Components has a chance to do that really well. It's really early, but we're involved, and our goal is to make it really, really easy to use.
There's a couple different patterns out there right now. Like there's the Remix loader pattern, and then there's also React server components. So why did you decide to go the React server component route versus the loader pattern?
Yeah, these are the two big patterns that we were really evaluating. On one hand, the data loader pattern is really simple. It's just like, oh, you're loading a page. Let's fetch all the data for that page and then hand it down to, your page component or whatever. And then that hands it down to subcomponents, and you've got everything that you need. And it's very simple to understand. So that's a very appealing way to go. And we were actually most of the way towards an implementation where that would work. We actually have code. Well, I mean, we've taken it out now, but we had code that really made that work really well. We spent a lot of time thinking about how we could make that really elegant. But then as React server components became more serious, as the React community, the React team started really pushing that, and then as you see Next coming out and providing a first-class implementation of it, and you see the reactions of the React community and how much it took to get there, React server components are the direction that the React team wants things to go. And so you can sit back and say, well, we don't agree with that, and we're going to do something different. But now you're sort of at odds with React. You start to diverge from React. And I think anytime that you take a path that is off the course of what some project is trying to do, then you're really working uphill. Like things are going to be harder. Everything that, it's like forking a code base and trying to have two forks of a code base sort of like stay synchronized. It's an impossible task. Like it can't ever be done well. It's almost impossible to do well. You become more and more frustrated. And this is React server components are a solution to the same kinds of problems that we were trying to solve, doing SSR and streaming. React server components answer that the same way that a data loader and still having SSR, but having a data loader pattern would allow us to solve that problem. If we've got these two ways to solve this problem, and one of them is the way that React wants to solve this problem, it starts to make a lot of sense that we should embrace what React is trying to do, if there's not a massively good reason to not do that, right? And there wasn't a massively good reason. And in fact, there's a lot of really good reasons to do React server components. And in fact, React server components look a little bit more like Redwood's cell pattern than data loader does, where you can kind of put your data fetching closer to the component that is using the data. But because now they're executing server side, generally, you solve most of the waterfall problem.
Do you want to explain the cell pattern for someone that's new to Redwood?
Yeah, so in Redwood, we have what are called cells. Cells are how you do data fetching. So a cell is a component that declaratively states what its data fetching is. So we use GraphQL right now in the current version of Redwood. So you've got a GraphQL query that you export from your cell. And then you've got a success component that you export, a loading component, you have an error component. So it's kind of splitting apart the various states that your data fetching, the life cycle that your data fetching component is going to go through. And you just export components or queries that represent that data fetching pattern. So you could kind of do the whole thing manually, where you're like, am I in a loading state? Then do this component. Am I in a successful state? Then do this component. So we've eliminated that sort of conditional boilerplate and just said, well, we know basically what your data fetching lifecycle is going to be. So just export the components and we'll figure it out for you. That allows us to run the process and then improve that process as well. It's hidden sort of in this higher order component that represents that data fetching pattern.
Do you mind introducing the idea of streaming? Because I think there's several things I think that are hard to digest for people as they hear React server components, and like you hear people be very opinionated or turned off of the idea of kind of like seeming like you're running React on the server, just like the mix of front end versus back end and how that gets kind of complicated. But how does the streaming come into play? It's with the data fetching with React server components, but how does that come into play with these?
Yeah, the streaming is really about the suspense capabilities that React has. So when you fetch a page, when you request a page, then you'll sort of, this is in the React server components universe, that page is going to execute on the server. So you'll start rendering your HTML and going through your React chain and producing that HTML out of the React components that you have. And you'll do your data fetching. If at some point you have some data fetching that you want to do, but you don't really want to wait for it until you ship some HTML down to your client, then you can create a suspense boundary, and that suspense boundary can have a loading state. At that point, the React renderer will essentially skip that component and its subtree because there's a suspense boundary there. It'll maybe fire off the data fetching queries in the meantime, but it's not going to wait for them to send down some HTML to the client. So then it'll just continue rendering the tree of stuff that it was going to do originally, minus that subcomponent that's doing that is underneath the suspense boundary. And it can ship that off to the client. It'll stream that down. It says, here you go, here's most of the page. But when the results of that subcomponent that is within the suspense boundary, when that completes, and so I'll say, in the meantime, it sends down just that loading state. So it's like, I'm not gonna figure out what everything is in this thing that you're doing underneath suspense. I'm just gonna send the loading state. So that's what you get. Client sees that. So client renders, client shows loading state. But the connection is still there, and when the contents of whatever was within that suspense boundary completes and can now render, then it'll stream that down, and that will then fill in instead of that loading state that it had previously shown. And you can do that without opening new connections. It's sitting there just streaming this as it comes. So it's streaming down bits of the page as those bits of the page are available to load. So that's the streaming and suspense part.
And it sounds like such a perfect fit. So for people that have tried this in like the Next.js world with a new app router directory, and they have similar to what you kind of discussed with cells of the idea of loaders and errors and those individual components that you can export. So they have that set up in Next.js. And this sounds like the perfect kind of translation to Redwood as well, because you already have that structure. Like this component exported in a certain way is going to do this. And so that seems like it's going to be a natural translation to doing that same thing with React server components. When you talked about React suspense, which I haven't looked at directly, I've done it in an abstracted way, but Redwood, I imagine, has the opportunity to abstract away suspense as well and still use that loader component setup similar to what you already have. So I would imagine like a pretty natural or maybe a smoother adoption for people that are already using Redwood that are looking to take advantage of React server components. Do you feel like it's like a natural progression for people?
I think so. We're still kind of early in the design phase for some of this stuff, so we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. But right now we're thinking that, yes, Redwood cells essentially become your React server components that do data fetching. And then when you're doing data fetching, then there's some function that you export that is in charge of doing the data fetching, and whatever comes out of that gets fed into the success component. And so all you have to do is worry about, like, okay, if I'm in my success component, I can assume that it was successful, right? You don't have to worry about like testing, what the results of your thing were, right? Like that's sort of baked into that pattern. And so if you have a loading state, by virtue of just providing a loading state at all, you would be telling us, hey, I want this to live underneath a suspense boundary. And we would just plumb that for you and be like, oh, you want a loading state? Then and this is a React server component, then I'll suspend on that and I'll send it down when it's ready. So you're sort of more implicitly saying what you want by just putting those things in there. And that way we can just hook them together in the right way to make that happen. And so you just need to worry about how do I do my data fetching? That's all in a standalone function. What is my success? What does this look like in a successful state? What does it look like in an empty state? So cells also provide you the ability to define an empty state, which is kind of nice because that's often different than when it's a non-empty state. So you've got a loading state if you want one, if you want to suspend on it. You've got a success state for success, an empty state, which is also a successful kind of a state, but a sort of a subcase. And if you don't have an empty state, then whatever, it just sends it to success. And then an error state. And all of these things you can sort of think about separately. And I think at the same time, we intend you to still be able to do everything with GraphQL that you've always been able to do with Redwood, but you're not forced to use GraphQL anymore. That's not the only way that you do things. In this new world of React Server components with Redwood, you can talk directly to the database in those cells. So your data fetching function that you export can talk directly to your Prisma database, or it could talk to Supabase directly, like whatever you want to do. You can use any data fetching pattern that you like from any external data source, any database, any RESTful API. You can get your data however you want. Now we'll make it really first class to use a Prisma, a MySQL or Postgres database via Prisma. That will be baked in, and there will be really good helpers for testing and working through that pattern, because that's really what we want to optimize for. But at the same time, you won't have to do that, and you won't have to think about GraphQL. You'll just reach directly into your database or some, fetch from some third-party thing, and you're off to the races. So it should be much, much easier to get started and experiment with Redwood. And that's a big reason for doing this as well, is to reduce the necessary complexity for people early on, where we think using GraphQL is really, really great if that's what you need. But it can put in place roadblocks for people who don't know that they need that yet.
I think that was one of the.
Oh, go ahead, James.
Sorry. I'll do one comment. I think that was one of the interesting things with Gatsby being pretty opinionated early on. And I haven't paid much attention to Gatsby recently, but they were like really, really revolving around this idea of GraphQL. Like all the plugins and things were tapping into GraphQL. And that was the default way that you had to load your data. And that works really well for people. But it was a big learning curve, or just I guess big learning curve, or maybe just like a new set of things that people had to learn that kind of took them away from maybe what they were used to. So having that flexibility of like, you have tooling and support around GraphQL because you've been doing that for a while, but also then now that people are able to run their own querying logic, data fetching logic in whatever way they want, it sounds like a pretty big win.
Yeah, and so how we think about it now is you'll start without GraphQL. You'll start by just reaching directly into your database. That'll execute on the server. Your life is very, very simple. Later on, when you create a mobile application or some other kind of a client, using some other thing, like maybe you're building a kiosk for like software for a kiosk at a mall or something, or you're building something that's going to run inside a car, like a Tesla or something, right? And you need an app that's going to be in there, or you have a command line tool or something, right? Something that's not a web client. At that point, GraphQL is a really, really nice technology for that. And so you start thinking, well, it'd be great to have a GraphQL API. I need that. And look, Redwood makes it super, super easy for me to do that. They've got great tooling for this because they've been doing that for 4 years. And so their GraphQL support is super top notch, like way better than anything that you've ever seen, right? But you can reach for it when you need it. And at that point, you maybe have now experienced GraphQL API developers on your team who understand the complexities and nuances of building a GraphQL API, because there are challenges there. You need to pay attention to security and performance in ways that people are often not prepared to do if they're not steeped in the intricacies of GraphQL. So building a GraphQL API is something that you have to pay attention to and do well. But once you have a GraphQL API, and if you have a team of GraphQL API engineers, if you're a front-end developer, wow, like why am I trudging around directly in my database? Like this is dumb and hard. And meanwhile, there's this really amazing GraphQL API that the mobile client gets to use. Like, why am I not just reaching to my data through GraphQL? So we want to make it very easy then to consume your own GraphQL API inside your cells that'll execute server side. So this is a GraphQL that is really not going through the outside world at all. It's just executing inside your infrastructure, going from wherever your front-end server is that's executing your React server components, still calling GraphQL to your GraphQL API, but internally, so very low latency. But now your front-end developers get this really nice sort of optimized data fetching experience, right? Because GraphQL, when you have a GraphQL API, it's a great pleasure to consume because you're just like, I want this field and this field and this field, and then from this I want to go and traverse into this. You get only the data that you want, and it's really nice, right? if you already have a GraphQL API. So make it easy to consume that. And then at that point, maybe your front-end developers are primarily consuming GraphQL in the new things that they're building. And you can sort of easily migrate from reaching directly to the database to using a GraphQL API when and where that makes sense. So this is kind of the journey that we imagine people taking in this new world of Redwood.
I have a question from Eric that I will share. He commented, so Redwood has defined boundaries between the API and the UI. So how big of a mix-up will React Server components be to the existing app design?
It is a further departure from the strict separation of front end and back end. So when we first started, I really wanted to make it easy to understand the difference between the front end and the back end. Like, where are the boundaries? I wanted to not mix those two execution environments at all. And that's how it started. And that was really nice. And there's advantages to that. But we already have violated that separation in when you're doing things like pre-render. So we've already kind of broached we've breached the wall that is this perfect separation. And I think at the end of the day, it's about ease. Like, we have to make Redwood easy to use. We sort of started upmarket. We basically built, this enterprise grade sort of application framework. What I want to do is go down market and build something that anyone can use on the weekend to do a hackathon, and that Redwood will be what you reach for. Not just when you're going to go build a giant startup or build some huge serious project with a big team. Redwood is really great for that because we focused a lot on that. But GraphQL puts it at a level where it's going to be higher up this sort of stack of complexity for people to choose, and all of the integrations and things that we have make it feel more complicated. So we're trying to go down market, down to the weekend warrior place, right? Where you're like, oh, I could just directly grab from my database. Like, that's why people use Next today. Next really does that super well. They've always done that. They started down market, which is fine. That's probably a better way to do it, right? You start down market and you become more sophisticated. We filled a niche that was up market, and we're going down market. And so that does change the paradigm. Like, this will React Server Components completely change that, because you'll do your data fetching now inside your component directly. Your database functionality is now in your React component. But with cells already, like when you're doing GraphQL, you're doing your query, like you specify your query in your component. So maybe it doesn't actually look tremendously different. And in fact, we hope to pull the database directory up out of the API directory. So right now in Redwood, you've got your web directory and you've got your API directory. The web is for all your React stuff, and the API has your database and your GraphQL code in it. But in this new world of React Server Components, you won't need all that GraphQL stuff necessarily, but you are probably going to still need a database, or we expect that many people will still want to use a database and have Prisma's migrations and all of the schema definition and everything that goes into creating and modifying your database over time, because that's any reasonable kind of application is going to need a rigorous way to migrate databases and things like that. So what we intend to do is pull the database directory out of the API directory. And so now you have web directory and database directory sitting next to each other. No API directory to begin with. If you want to do GraphQL later on, set up your GraphQL, and now you get your API directory, or maybe we rename it to GraphQL or something, right? So it's more specific. And so everything goes inside your web directory and your database directory, but you can split out your functionality that way. So yes, this will be a new paradigm. It will be more of a mixing of execution sort of place, but React Server Components fundamentally is that. It's saying, well, this React Server component is going to render on the server. It's going to data fetch and render on the server, and then send down to the browser. However, subsequent pages and things start, they are now executing in the browser, and if you already have the code for a component on the client, then you're just now doing a API call essentially to the backend where it runs the stuff in the server, and it can send it back down. So it becomes this mixed pattern very quickly, and so I think we are going to diverge from that sort of strict separation in a big way.
Yeah.
It's gone, because while that separation can be nice, like people have been operating in that world with Next since the beginning of Next, and it hasn't like killed anyone. Everyone has survived. Everyone can understand that, right? And with server component, with these things, like you start not thinking as much about the execution location. Really, you're just trying to get things done.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to bring up as well. Is like we've been mixing these things with Next.js specifically, but with a lot of frameworks have mixed in the ability for like you're in seemingly a React ecosystem or a Vue ecosystem or Svelte ecosystem, but then you have functionality based on frameworks to do all the traditional backend stuff that we're used to. So that becomes naturally a part of the development process for people just building applications as developers. And I've kind of like, I give my pitch to people as they're starting their career and looking for jobs. I'm not saying you have to be an expert at both. You won't be an expert at both, but like I think having experience on both front and back end so that you understand how the whole thing fits together is super important. There was a comment in the chat, and I had the same question too about the idea for potentially continuing to have an API directory if you wanted something like custom functions that you wanted to call from a front end, or this is often the case as well. Like you have a web application, but you also have a mobile client. You mentioned that for Chatterbug earlier. Within Redwood, do you have now, and do you see that continue to be a situation where you can develop your own custom API functions that maybe you call from your front end as if it was a SPA interacting with a server, and or like if you have other clients that are consuming data, do you see that continuing to be around with the future of like having the ability to define those API endpoints?
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe we pull that function. So right now there's a directory called functions that you can put inside your API directory that becomes your other endpoints besides your GraphQL endpoint. So you've got your GraphQL endpoint inside the functions there, and that runs GraphQL, but you can put other functions next to it, and those will all get exposed, and they can do whatever you need to do. So maybe we pull out functions as well into a top level thing, and that's where you can do your additional functions work, because that is a really valuable thing. Like, how do you deal with webhooks and other things that are that don't really fall into kind of the React pattern? It's just it's just an endpoint that you want to expose. So yeah, absolutely, we'll continue to make that stuff possible and work, even if you're not using GraphQL.
There was another question a while back that I'm actually really interested in. And it was a question around edge deployment. So we've kind of talked about like the idea of serverless and being able, to your point originally with Redwood, being able to deploy something very easily to a serverless environment, which was kind of the dream, right? When we didn't have to deploy a full node backend to Heroku or wherever, and you could just go to like the free RDCI/CD stuff set up with Netlify and now Vercel and Cloudflare and others. What is the impact of edge deployment have on, or the ability to deploy to the edge have in deploying Redwood specifically, or maybe just frameworks in general?
Well, we want Redwood to be able to work in an edge function kind of environment. So we're building it in a way that won't preclude that. Now that's work that will be kind of down the road. And we'll continue to make Redwood work on Netlify and Vercel. That's just a matter of sort of spinning up build adapters and making sure that there's a server, something that you deploy onto a cloud function of some sort, a Lambda, that acts as the front end and can kind of do the server executions of things. So that will still work. That's not what we're going to optimize for, but it's important to us that works as much as possible. But there will also be features there that are not going to work as well. Right now, we're also adding real-time GraphQL support. And so certain things that are going to require more persistent connections are going to not work super well in Lambda functions. Now, I hope that Lambdas continue to evolve and Cloud Functions continue to evolve in their capabilities so that we can target those environments more. But we're not going to hold back Redwood features because they won't work on a serverless platform right now. We would love them to. If we can make them work there, we will. But we're not going to not do something because they won't, right? We'll say, if you have a serverful environment, if you have a front-end server that you're running on AWS, Render, wherever, everything in Redwood's going to work beautifully. But we'd still love to work serverlessly and in edge environments as well, and working with whatever the kind of interesting things that you want to do with edge functions layered on top of. And before you even, before Redwood even gets the request, like those things are things that you'll still be able to do if you're using those environments, or you're putting CloudFront edge functions on top. Like you can do certain localization things or whatever. We want to make sure that all those things work in ways that you would expect.
There's someone also kind of commented on this. The idea of the edge, I think sometimes it's easy for people to really sell the edge, and it's really easy for potential consumers or potential developers without digging into it to think like, oh, the edge just automatically makes everything faster. But there's one like big caveat to that. Like the edge, if you have all of your functionality that's able to run in the edge, and that's a different runtime than we're traditionally used to, there's limitations. But there's also the database has a big impact on this, because the edge, like your stuff is deployed all across the world. But traditionally, and this is changing, databases are deployed to that like one instance, and some databases are now doing replica sets, which help like make intelligent decisions on which database instance to query based on which instance of the edge your code is actually being hit. So do you have any thoughts on like any modern databases stand out to you, or like things that you think will work well and with what you're doing with Redwood, or just kind of planning on, I don't know, like addressing that when you get there, I guess? I don't know.
Yeah, that early on in Redwood's history, that was sort of my dream as well for Redwood, that if we could make it work as this Jamstack kind of a framework, then you'd have your whole React client could be delivered via global CDN. You'd have Lambda functions for your business logic, which you could sort of replicate around the world. The challenge always was, how do you do your database efficiently? Because it does, if you have Lambdas, around the world, but they still all have to go to some centralized, East Coast US database, then you maybe get a little bit of goodness there, but you're not with cold starts and these other things. You're probably not going to get to where you want to be performance wise. Better to probably optimize somewhere else. So yeah, we looked into a bunch of databases that were more likely to be replicated, and I invested in a bunch of them, like FaunaDB, super interesting. But they become really challenging because some of them like Fauna, the challenge for Fauna has always been you have to learn a new query language to use it. So you can do really powerful things, but you have to use kind of this new query language. And so getting people over that hurdle becomes the challenge. Fly.io has some really neat read replica stuff. The writes aren't really replicated, they're sort of forwarded, but they have like read replicas that you can also write to, but the writes get forwarded. They have a bunch of cool blog posts about how they do that. So, but it increases complexity, sort of like managing and maintaining anything that looks like that kind of infrastructure is going to be a little bit more work, or a lot more work, than just having your database in one single location and reading and writing to it. And that usually will take you pretty far, right? For instance, GitHub, for as long as I was at GitHub, we only ever had a single database that you read and wrote to, right? And it didn't prevent GitHub from working.
I feel like they've done pretty well.
I think that's the reality there, is that you probably don't have to worry about it. If you're a startup, it's like, don't worry about it. Like, that's not your primary concern. Your concern is building something that people actually want to use. That's pretty much it. That's basically your only concern for the first 5 years. Unless you're some super hyperscale thing, and then you maybe have to worry about scale earlier. But for most startups, it's, make something that people want and get the word out there, and worry about read replicas later on. Hopefully in the future, that's just sort of, we have the options where it's like, yeah, that's just how it works. It's perfect, works every time. It's not crazily more expensive than just having a single database, right? Cost matters for most people. And when you're doing fancy things, you have a bunch of replicas and you're running them from around the world, it's more expensive and it's more error prone. So like there's always, and again, it's technology. So there's always trade-offs. Always, always, always. There's always trade-offs. The more fancy you get, the more likely it is to break, and probably the more expensive it costs. But if you go forward 10 or 20 years, things can look really different and still be affordable and work way better. But generally you have to worry about trade-offs. So yeah, I would love to get to where we could recommend like, hey, just use this database provider and there's only one and everybody uses it. It's amazing, though that does not seem to be the direction that the world is going, right?
Yeah.
And depending on how you need to use data, it can matter a lot too. What your data operations look like matters a lot. What kind of database you need and what performance characteristics you need and how much you're reading and writing. A lot of websites read a lot and write very little, but that's not every website. If you're writing a lot and reading less, then that kind of strategy maybe isn't going to solve that problem for you, right? So it really is very dependent on what you're doing.
Makes a really good point, though, is a lot of times people are trying to solve for a problem that doesn't even exist. And for startups, if you can fix that product market fit, then that gets you 90% of the way there in terms of success.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the problem of over optimizing or prematurely optimizing in sort of technology is always the danger. We love solving problems as sort of
Yes.
folks. And when you're faced with a problem, you're like thinking 2 steps ahead and you're like, okay, what if I do that? Then, we're probably going to need this other stuff in the future. And so you make this cool abstraction and write all these edge cases for things that you're going to need in the future. And then it turns out you don't ever need any of those things. And you've just wasted a lot of your time and made your code 100 times more complicated. So I'm a big fan of solving problems when they happen and waiting to see what those problems are. I mean, you want to be a little bit ahead of the problem so that you don't get crushed by the problem. But a lot of it to me is not painting yourself into a corner, like choosing solutions that are open enough to solve future problems, but you're not yet solving them. You're sort of reserving them to solve in the future, but not solving your current problems in a way that makes it harder to solve future problems. So you need to know enough about your future problems to not paint yourself into a corner, but the restraint to not actually go and solve those problems before you need to.
I love that.
There's a whole thing about like risk theory that a lot of times as humans, we're so fearful of what's to come that's how we make our decisions, versus like with risk theory, a lot of times you can walk it back more than you think you can, or you can find a different escape hatch that you might not have thought about otherwise. But again, we make so many decisions out of fear or what we think those perceived problems might be.
Yeah, this we actually did this at Chatterbug. We were trying to think about the different ways that people would want to pay for it. And we're like, okay, well, we can get companies to buy sort of group plans for their employees and make it a benefit. But how do they want to pay? Do they want to pay like per person, or what's the cadence of what they're going to pay? Or are they going to provide percentage, like how much of it they'll cover 50%, but the employees have to cover another 50%. And we got down this big list of like ways to do it, and we implemented like all of these different ways, and then we never actually charged anyone in those ways. And so we had this like massively complicated sort of billing component, of which we used like 2 code paths for the next 3 years, right? And so this is the thing. Like you think about it, what you need to solve, and you solve it without realizing that nobody's going to ever need that.
No.
Yep.
That's so good. Yeah. It's funny how people can be super, super opinionated really early on. And a lot of the times it does come down to like, we may hit that, but as a startup, honestly, most likely you don't, right? Like only so many startups go on to have a level of success where like real world scale becomes an issue. And ideally you do. Ideally, like you go and you build up a user base and you continue to grow, all those things. But it's not an easy thing to get there. Thinking about React server components, which I actually don't know the general state. So maybe you can give us an update on the state of React server components in general. And then also like this new version or new epoch, the next epoch of Redwood, where you're kind of integrating that, making that a first-class citizen, kind of changing how you build applications with Redwood. What's the state of that transition now? Is that something that's publicly available? Is it a work in progress? Do you have estimates of like when people would start being able to work with that?
Yeah, so in the overall React Server Components universe, you've got essentially one implementation, and that's with Next.js in the app directory. And they call that stable, I guess, though I'm a little concerned,
Yeah.
honestly, that they've sort of jumped to that, calling it stable. Meanwhile, they're shipping like React Canaries as part of their sort of stable release of that, which, you know, and as you sort of brought up in the beginning, that's caused a little bit of concern from the community about like, how mature is this technology? Is it really mature enough to call it stable? Like a bunch of vendors that are writing, clients to be called from this, like Apollo, they don't know exactly how to solve all these problems with, streaming React and whatnot. And it's hard for them to get guidance. So I think there's this period that we're in right now, which is React Server Components are available, but only by kind of one player. And we don't know exactly how to solve all the problems that has introduced. So that's where they are. React Server Components, they're kind of spec'd out, but there's not a huge amount of, the specification is a little, like I can't say it's been fully documented. We sat down with Dan Abramov and had a great discussion with him, and the React team has been really helpful in this, and they're very open and accessible. But figuring out exactly how to implement this stuff is still a little bit of a moving target in ways, right? And it's fairly complex to implement. And so you're not going to see a huge number of implementations of this, which is interesting, right? Like they've created this new technology that is challenging enough to implement that only really some of the bigger frameworks are going to do it. Eventually you'll have people that create very simple frameworks that just have kind of the basic workings of React Server Components that then will probably grow into larger frameworks. But right now it takes a fair bit of engineering effort to actually implement. So that's where we are. There's one implementation that you can use, and it's Next.js. We're hoping to be sort of number 2 in like a real framework, because we want to be part of how the decisions are made. And so that brings us to where we are with Redwood, which is we're actively digging into this stuff aggressively. We have some of the early streaming support and suspense support inside the RedwoodJS router that is there. You can go look on the main branch on GitHub and you'll see like some of the recent commits are for making the React stuff possible. And there's an experimental, you can actually use some of the very earliest bits of it that we have, which is not much. It's more of the infrastructure to make it work. You can't really go and actually write a React Server component yet. But we're hard at work on that. And so if you're interested in helping out, if anyone out there is interested in helping create a React Server component implementation, if that's high on your bucket list, well, we are who you should talk to, because that's what we're doing right now. And so there's not too much for people to play with yet, but you can go on the RedwoodJS forums and search around for React Server Components and the SSR and streaming stuff and see where we're at. And get in touch with the people that are working on that if you want to be in the know of when we have things to test. But we're really hoping to have a lot figured out by late September, which is when the first RedwoodJS conference is. September 26th through 29th, RedwoodJS Conf. It's going to be in Southern Oregon, Grants Pass, Oregon, the United States. And it's going to be 2 days of... Was I supposed to wait for this for the plug part of the segment?
I was going to plug this, so I have to come up with a different plug, but you are perfect.
Or you could double plug.
You're perfect. Keep going.
And so 2 days of talks. The middle 2 days will be talks. There's a day on the front end where we'll have workshops from Apollo and Prisma, and some other cool kinds of workshops where you could have access to the core team, the RedwoodJS core team. If you have a startup and you're doing something and you want to get a lot of advice from us or give us really good feedback on what you need in the framework, there's a workshop on the front end that you could participate in. And then on the 4th day, we'll have a fun day where we're going to go and do stuff around Grants Pass, like mountain biking or hiking, stuff like that. So that's the conference. It's going to be fairly small, around 150 people probably. So we've got a great venue that's kind of going to be awesome for that more intimate experience, which I love. Like the early Ruby and Rails conferences were like this. They were a couple hundred people. and they were amazing. I met so many people. I made connections that helped me in my career. It's so much better to me than like a 10,000 person or even a 500, 700 person conference, because you run into the same people over and over. Like, it's inevitable that you actually have conversations with the people that you want to at those conferences. So that's kind of how we wanted to optimize it for and start.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to have some stuff ready for then in the React Server Components sort of world, where it's not going to be done, but there will be a lot of decisions made and some experimental versions of Redwood that you can use to play around with it. That is our goal right now.
That's exciting. I'm jealous.
Yep.
I assume Amy is going.
It's gonna be fun.
Yes. Tom and I will both
Amy's-
be there in
Amy's
person.
giving a talk. Yeah,
I am.
I'll
Nice.
give the keynote, show off like where we're at with React Server Components and what you can do.
And then for anybody that's not able to make it in person, will this be like live streamed virtually as well?
Yes.
Yeah, that's exciting. And this is you probably said this, but this is the first one, right? Like this is a pretty big deal for Redwood and the community.
Yeah. No, it's gonna be great. I love
Awesome.
doing conferences like this.
Yeah.
We're gonna have a blast. And Grants Pass is beautiful. If you want to see some real redwood trees, that's your chance.
I don't think I've ever seen any.
Come on up to Grants Pass, Oregon.
There's
Stunning.
the pitch.
Stunning. Yeah.
Super cool. Well, I'm excited about all of that. I think it's time to move into the last section of the podcast, which is our picks and plugs. So you can either plug something additionally or just go back to upcoming conference. But pick is something that we've enjoyed recently, something we bought or watched or read or whatever. And plug is something that we want to selfishly promote. Either one of you want to go first?
Why don't you go ahead, Amy?
Oh boy, I did find another one.
Sorry.
So no, it's totally fine. I can double pick, as Eric said in the chat, Omega pick the RedwoodJS conference, but I'm going to pick Shortery. So this was actually just introduced to me, but this is an automation for shortcuts. So if you're on a Mac, it will enhance the triggers that you have to be able to run shortcuts. So you can have it run stuff as soon as you connect to Wi-Fi or different triggers and things like that. So kind of supercharges what you already have on your machine. So check that out, Shortery, and I will include a link in the chat. And then for plug, we kind of alluded to this on our last recording, but you can follow me on Threads, which is exciting. And my handle is self-teach me, and I'll include a link to that as well.
Nice. I can go next. Tom, I am a recent father, first time father, and most of my conversations these days revolve around babies with other people. And anyway, one of the things that was really interesting going to the pediatrician early on was how specific of an answer they were looking for in terms of how many ounces of milk does the baby eat a day and how many diapers and all those things. So my wife found an app for that, obviously, called Tally. And anyway, it kind of does exactly what you'd expect with that. It lets you tally up like how much you, like if you're a woman, like how much you pumped or how much you breastfed or formula or diapers and what type of diapers, if you want to get into those details. And they also have, we haven't done this, but they have like kind of an easy button add-on thing that you can buy and kind of put next to, like if you have a changing station in your house, like for diapers, you can like press the button on there, which automatically records it, which I think is really neat, but it's kind of expensive. So we don't have that. We just have the app, but it's worked like really well. It does exactly what we need to be able to track all those details. So Tally, Talli is the app. And I'm going to plug the Learn, Build, Teach Discord. And I did this last week, but I'll call out a specific, not necessarily feature, but just something we've been doing recently where we have open conversations on Thursdays. And 2 weeks ago, I ended up doing kind of a live teaching of kind of big O notation, and was doing it just off the cuff, like writing scratch code and kind of talking through how that translates to big O notation, et cetera. And then we followed that up the next week, which is this past Thursday, with more of the same. And I really enjoyed it. Like I enjoyed almost being in like a more formal, almost like you're in a classroom again as a teacher. For me, it was really nice. And then I've gotten really good feedback on enjoying the session, and then also posting on Twitter about potentially doing more of that type of content in the future. And people seem to be excited about that. So anyway, that's an example of something that we do in Discord. I hope to continue to do more on that topic and then continue to do more on other topics as well. But you can find the Learn, Build, Teach Discord at learnbuildteach.com.
All right. Okay. So for my pick, I'm going to tell you about this Japanese anime show, which is called Death Note. Have either of you heard of this?
No.
Or it was a book. It was a book first, like a mini volume on your shelf. It's like this long, right? So so it was a manga book originally. It's called Death Note. It is about a notebook that is dropped into the human world by these sort of monster creatures that live in that sort of god world called Shinigami. But in this notebook, if you write a person's name, then that person will die.
Oh my goodness.
And so this student comes across this book and decides that they're going to use it to make the world a better place.
Mm.
And so the rest of the series is about how this person does this and how there's another person that tries to track them down, and it's sort of the sparring between the student and the sort of detective that's trying to track them down. And it's amazing. I first read it 15 years ago, probably 10 years ago. But there's an animated series now on Netflix, also called Death Note, that is really well done, which is surprising because generally these sort of adaptations are not very well done. But this one is done. It's like 37 episodes. I just finished watching it like a day ago. And it's great. It's just really good content. It's just very clever. The cat and mouse of it, and like world building and the exploration of how the rules of this book play out and how people are leveraging the details of how this notebook works to sort of like evade each other. It's really, really excellent. Worth a watch.
Fun. I've never actually watched anime, but I always feel like left out when people reference ones and other people jump in. They're like, oh yeah, it's so amazing. So one day I need to like take the time and watch
Now's your
one.
chance.
Yeah.
Now's your chance.
We're big fans of Miraculous on Netflix, which is kind of an anime feel to it, but it's 3D. So, anyways, it will be fun to check out. It's not real anime. I don't feel like it's really anime, but anyways, it's a TV show that my kids love that I have gotten into.
Yeah, nice. I'll check that out. Okay, so for my plug, I'm going to. This is the first time that I'm talking about this publicly. So you get to.
We love this.
Yes.
This is what dreams are made of.
It. All right, so RedwoodJS. Well, one of the other core team members and I have been working on an application with RedwoodJS that's built with RedwoodJS, and we're ready for more people to start using it. So we've been using it ourselves internally. There's a handful of people that use it, but we wanted to open it up and get a few more people using it. So I'll tell you what it's called. It's called Spoke, and the URL is spoke.run. So spoke.run, spoke.run. So it's open. You can go and you can sign up for it and you can log in. So what Spoke is a social network for creators, for people that are building things. You can think of it as a bit of a cross-section between Twitter, Reddit, GitHub, and like a tool you might use to stay up to date with each other when you're working on a team of people who are building something together. This comes out of some ideas that we had at GitHub. We had this app called the Team app, which was like an internal sort of Twitter and a place for recording ideas. And this was really powerful, that anyone on the team could have an idea for some way that we wanted to improve GitHub and write a long form post about what that idea was. And then we'd collect these and they'd become the zeitgeist of what was possible within Redwood. And so we'd combine those ideas and refine them, and those would eventually become projects that we actually worked on at GitHub. And I loved that app. It was really amazing. And there hasn't been anything quite like that I've seen before that was kind of simple enough and streamlined enough out there. And so that's what this is, sort of, but it's not just that. it's also the best parts of like Twitter for me are when people talk about the things that they're building and chronicle the builds that they have or the startups that they're building and give updates on where they're at, what's going on, the challenges that they had. And all of, anytime someone's building like an electronics project or woodworking, I love reading the chronicles of the build. And so that's what Spoke has become as we've worked on it, is a really great place to chronicle that and build a community of people around it that want to sort of participate in whatever you're building and talk about it and maybe talk about what they're building as well. And so that's what Spoke is. And we're looking to get some more people on it so that we can just have some more content and traffic that will help us then guide where we want to go next with the kinds of features that we're working on. So go check it out, spoke.run, sign up. And if you're building something, any kind of project, it could be really anything. I have an electronics project that I'm building. So if you want to know what my electronics project is, you have to go.
It's pretty cool.
Log in and find out. And Rob, the guy I'm building it with, who's also on the core team, Rob Cameron, does a tremendous amount of amazing woodworking. He builds cabinets and tables, furniture, and he's got some really great YouTube videos that he's been putting up on there of his builds. So if you love creating things with your hands or software and you want to show people what you're doing, we envision this also as kind of a GitHub type thing, but for projects that fall outside the scope of just software. So that this could be the Spoke URL would be what you would share when you tell people about, hey, I'm working on this electronics thing. Go to this URL to figure out more about it. We'd like Spoke to be that as well.
James, you could share some of your woodworking stuff.
I know. We'll see when my next project is. We got to make it through this move first, and then get settled
Another
in.
project.
Yes,
document.
That project I think is definitely the priority right now. But I love that idea though. That's always been my favorite thing about the developer community, is how empowering it is to be a developer from the perspective of like, we can use code to solve not every problem, but a lot of problems in the world, or just build stuff for fun, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
So I love the idea of having that be the theme for this. That's pretty exciting. And the fact that it was announced first here is pretty amazing. If we bring you back every month, will you promise to have a new like secret to reveal?
Yeah, well, next time I gotta actually launch the electronics project that I'm building. That might be a little while, but maybe it'll be done by the next time we talk.
There you go. I like it. Cool. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited. I mean, Amy and I have talked about this, but super excited for her and her role, and have been a distant fan, I guess, of everything that's been going on at Redwood over the past couple of years. So exciting to kind of learn more about the next generation, iteration, epoch, however people want to phrase it, for what's to come. So thanks for sharing all that.
Absolutely. It's fabulous to have Amy on the team. She's going to level up all of our design and planning skills.
Yeah, it's been fun.
So you can all look forward to that.
Cool. If you are listening in the podcast version of this, please make sure to leave a rating and review if you enjoyed it. Also, caveat, to help other people continue to find the podcast so we can continue to bring on amazing guests like Tom. In the meantime, that's all we got. That's goodbye number one. And now we say goodbye to
number two.
Everybody in the stream, everybody on YouTube and Twitch. Thanks for watching. Check out Spoke, check out Redwood, and at the very least, like, keep an eye on Redwood announcements for when these features and stuff become available that you can play with. And also, if you are interested and available and want to go to Oregon for the first conference, that's a huge opportunity too, which should be a ton of fun.
We'll be there. Follow RedwoodJS on Twitter and star that GitHub repo. Smash that like button.
Smash that. Yes, exactly. Cool. All right. Thank you everyone for checking in live. We will catch you all later.